So I want to offer a few reflections, and the theme that I chose today was deep. It was called Deep Roots and Renewing Our Vision, because I'm interested in, I'm very interested in both these areas, like like how some of the very simple tools that I feel are present within Buddhism and within other spiritual teachings, actually, um, like how simple, relatively simple tools can take us very deeply into a transformation of how we're experiencing life and how we're experiencing our being, and thus the responses that come from there. So, and this for me really, really relates to practice because, you know, like often you hear about these schemes, these different ways of relating to practice. So in the forest tradition, um, they can say, well, first you study the practice, study the Dharma, practice the Dharma, realize the Dharma, and then Ajahn Chah, who was the founder of the lineage the monastic lineage that I was trained in, talked about being Dharma. And so there's something where, like, it's actually quite a radical transformation that is asked for, that is being called for. And I think it's kind of it's becoming more and more clear in our times, with the ways in which kind of modernity and even institution within Buddhism can it can become very conditioned by the norms that we're carrying unconsciously. And yet there's something very radical about in potential about the Buddhist teaching. So say like Ajahn Chah, at the time that um he at the time that he was a young monk, he actually went very much against the institution of Buddhism in Thailand. So he went back into the forest. Apparently there was a whole movement in Thailand at the time where it was said, enlightenment isn't possible, and you would get diplomas for studying, Dharma and things, but it's like, well, enlightenment isn't possible. And so off he went into the forest with his bowl and became renunciate, and he was like, he chucked it all up and um, and did something very radical, which his some of his teachers had done also, but that he was like, actually, this is for practice, this is for realization, this is for being Dharma. And his teachings then became very revered, and that's very wonderful. But then what do? We go, oh, well, he got it right, so I'll replicate that. And then we, here we go again. We create another institution where it's like, well, actually, we have to have the courage to be realizing within our own being the core teachings and looking into them within our own being. So I have a lot of respect for the lineage that I was trained in, a lot of love for the teachings of Ajahn Chah and of Ajahn Sumedha, Ajahn Sucitto, Ajahn Chandasiri, Tanisara Kittisaro, who've come through that lineage, and it's also really, and also I also recognize that the institution that is part of it is very patriarchal. It has a lot of difficulty responding to feedback. It's like, so this is a kind of paradox within practice that I think it's really important to take on board the potential of the teachings for transformation and for deep transformation, and to take that seriously within our own being. And I've noticed myself that, like, there's this paradox about approaching practice where in my own being, I've been really drawn to practice since I was very, very young, since I was a teenager. And that also, as I came to practice, I came with all, of course, my expectations and the ways in which I've been conditioned. And that's surely still weaving through in certain ways. But what I want to point out is that often in modern Western culture, we come with like the habitual attitudes of, say, an individualistic approach to practice, or an approach to practice where we're thinking about increasing our own well-being in the ways that we think we know are good, if you like, or of resolving problems. And I think Dharma can help us to do this to some degree, you know, and yet at some point, we need to go beyond these paradigms. There's actually a huge depth of potential within us that can help us to know much more what true well-being is, bring us into a very different model of relationship with our own being and with the world that we're part of. So, of course, this is a delicate dance because as I recognize myself in practice, a certain level of safety is very important. So for myself, like I've had to really learn to do a lot of grounding meditation to learn how to become safe within my body, let's say, to find safety in friendships, in spiritual friendships, in community. There's a certain level of safety in practice that is really very important to help the mind to stabilize, to be able to open, to be able to have insight. That's true. That's very, very true at certain levels. And it's also very true that sometimes that can become limiting if we're like then afraid to go beyond our safety, or we're imposing our models of safety on somebody else and it's not actually safe for them, you know. So Bayo Okomolafe, who I'll quote more of later, who's a very wonderful Nigerian philosopher, he's really wonderful. He says at a certain point, safety is coddling us, and safety is banishing the visitors, the ontological guests that travel and takes some parts of our body's wisdom. Safety is pushing them away. Our bodyguards are taking away the nourishment that we need to become different. So we need to risk. And this is kind of, it's a lovely invitation to really notice within our being when something that we're holding to that helps us to feel safe is really for our well-being, for our deepest well-being, and when we're kind of limiting our potential. And this relates to me to that, what I was saying earlier, how we can often come with our individualistic mindset to practice, because there's something about that breaking down within practice that can feel quite scary. And also it really opens us into a different sense of being and abundance that I think the Buddhist teachings are really pointing towards. And I'll say more about that. So, I was reading an article by an organization called degrowth.org, and they say if spiritual practice are not accompanied by a radical shift in our worldview away from separation and commodification towards interbeing and relationality, we risk succumbing to what Ronald Purser calls Mac mindfulness. So what I'm pointing to is this deep call to come underneath our habits of taking practices just for me and mine, or our habitual models, and a deep call into the relationality that we're already part of. And this, I think, is really bringing us into a much deeper shift and place of practice, which is very much more alive than just our thoughts or our kind of when we come at practice from like, this is what I want to be getting from it. And this is there in the classical teachings. So it's said that, you know, classically we have these, you know, schemes of different stages of awakening that I don't really like those schemes. I'm like, how could it all be mapped out so so clearly, you know? But the Ajahn Sumedha used to talk a lot about like the first stage of awakening is called stream entry, where we're said to enter the stream. And I like to think of this as we're like re-entering the stream of being somehow. And when you're said to attain, so that's another word, like come into stream entry, you're said to be letting go of the first three fetters, which are attachment to rites and rituals, which doesn't mean letting go of those things in the heart of them. It means like letting go of our attachment of using them to think we're going to get something. Attachment to rite and rituals, attachment to personality view. Now, this is a difficult one because we obviously need to be working with that, with our personality, with our sense of self, with how we're operating in the world. But what Ajahn Sumedha would constantly point to is that we have a bigger awareness than our personality, that there's an awareness that can receive the habits and thoughts that are coming. And this is pointing to a deeper level of our being. And the third fetter that we let go of is doubt. So there is something about this invitation into a deeper level of our being that is there in the very classical teachings. And the coming into relationality. So even if we think about the refuges, coming into relation with that which is awake within us, which isn't loaded with our habitual agendas, just that which is awake. This is a very radical invitation. It's beyond what we know. It's inviting us into a different way of knowing. And then the teachings, like the very simple teachings on, say, breath or body, as we come into breath. I know many of you have heard me say this before, but I really, really feel it. The invitation into relationality that is here in our breath. We're giving and receiving the whole time. We're part of a world of where we're being nourished and where we're giving back the whole time. We are not an individual being. We are open systems. We are an individual being in the sense of we have this being that we have agency within. But once it's rooted back into the network of life, we actually have much more clarity and agency and a different way of coming into being. Our ethics change, say. We become much more connected and caring when we come back into this web of reciprocity and relationality. And so it's really, we have a choice, I think, as we come into, say, breath practice. I mean, is it just me sitting here following my breath, Or it's me sitting here following my breath, or am I actually like deepening into, the attention is deepening into what this breath is carrying, what we're experiencing through it, the openness that it's bringing, the nourishment that it's bringing, the acknowledgement that we're part of a greater life through this very simple practice. It brings us rhythm, so it steadies, and then our way of attending changes. So it's like, to really explore these things as we give attention to these things, our tasting of them deepens, and that shifts how we're attending. And so then community, the third refuge, Sangha, becomes something very different. It's like I learned, well, Sangha is I learned in words, Sangha is the community of practitioners. And I was like, well, it inspires me in the sense of that's happened over ages, in the sense of practice has happened over ages. There's an energetic support there. And then I realized that actually for me, community is much, much deeper. It's this web of interrelationships as well, where we're constantly supported, we're constantly giving back. So there's a resource here. And there's also a waking up towards accountability into this web, it's a reflection on how do I want to be relating with this heart, this being in this world that we're part of. And it's a very, very deep shift from the individualistic me, my well-being model. And I do believe this is fundamentally there in the early teachings. So many of you may have read Tanisra's recent article on breaking the silence in Gaza, another article that she's just written in Dharma Spaces in response to Vince Corey Horn's article that he brought out. And it's really beautiful in that for me, because she's pointing to how in early Buddhism there was this principle of reciprocity in community that has been very often missed in the way institutions have formed up, that have become very hierarchical or top down, and where there's a lack of responsiveness, of capacity to receive feedback or to respond to, like, the current world situation actually. And she's talking about in the article about how there was this principle of pavarana, which I remember doing pavarana ceremonies as a monastic, where you're there as a whole community and everybody bows and you invite feedback from the community. And so this principle of transparency, of community, of feedback, of reciprocity in a certain way to help each other to grow is there in the very early discipline in the Buddhist community. And then she also points out very aptly, because my thing was, well, it's like the nuns invited feedback from the monks, but the monks did not invite feedback from the nuns, so it had been already co-opted into, like, a long time ago, into the patriarchal system. But the principle is there, and she's saying, as Bhikkhu Bodhi said about nuns' ordination, come back to the principle, come back to the heart of it, this principle of reciprocity, feedback, mutual care, actually, for our shared well-being, which is a very different level, again, from our individualistic, I'll get what I need, And so I think when we use that, or not when we come into our practice with this heart, it can be a long and gentle and surprising and sometimes contradictory deepening that is happening. It's not all happening in one direction, but it's almost like our being is starting to know that we're part of a bigger network. And what do I want to do from there? So that organization I was talking about earlier, the degrowth organization, they're talking about how spiritual practice is really important in systems change in the world that we're part of. And they're saying that spirituality can act as the chrysalis or the cocoon for an ontological metamorphosis. So ontological is that which is concerned with being. Spirituality can act as the chrysalis or the cocoon for an ontological metamorphosis from an ontology of separation to one of relationality. And this is really, really what I am talking about. So yeah, in the Buddhist teachings, we have quite some tools to move into this. The refuges, which I've already spoken about, which are for each of us to keep exploring in these ways. The breath, the nourishment there, rhythm, reciprocity, interdependence, what comes from there. The Buddha talked a lot about a vision of dana, of generosity, which for me is related to this. We're part of a web of life where we're being constantly nourished, and what are we giving back into this? As we recognize more deeply, we're part of a sacred web of life. This is our community. How do we care as we tune into that? What ethics come from there? What listening comes from there? How does that shape our listening? And then, very importantly as well, the way the teachings work, for me, is that they don't point us to a fixed point of liberation. They're asking us to be continually listening It's a dynamic invitation, so it's kind of strategic, say, in a certain way. So say the Heart Sutra that talks about form and emptiness, you know, form is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form. It's like our mind goes, bing, what am I supposed to do with that? You know, it's like, and yes, exactly. What are you supposed to do with it? You're supposed to not know what to do with it, or you know, we're supposed to enter into that invitation. What does that mean? What happens when spaciousness meets the form of my experience? What happens when deep listening meets that? How do I access deep listening when I'm caught in the nitty-gritty of this is so painful? It's a radical invitation. And wisdom, you know, the word prajna, often we take wisdom as, you know, that which knows this, or that which knows that which knows, say, what is causing harm. That's true in a certain sense. But it also means before knowing, the different way of knowing that is there when we're before knowing. Before we fixed something, that heart that is sensitive. And it's very interesting to me and poignant. So say that chant that we chanted earlier, the teaching chant on the 5 subjects of recollection that talk about I'm the nature to age, to sicken, to die. All that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me. The Buddha points us to look at suffering and loss. He also points us to look at the abundant heart, the immeasurable heart, the generosity of life. But there's something for me about these points of loss and loss of control, where we either can harden in our habitual ways, or there is an undoing there that we no longer know how to respond. And there's an invitation there into this depth. It's a very poignant place of potential deeper connection and resource. That might be ancestral, it might be archetypical, it might be elemental. How do we find resource there? We've gone beyond what we know. And this isn't to romanticize it. We really often need support there. We need human support. We need to be caring for each other. But it's exactly that. Do we retract into our own space, or do we give and receive care at that point? Do we allow different ways of knowing? So wisdom can actually really open here. So I'm going to quote something from Bioeconomy again, because, you know, I really love the classical early teachings, and I also really love that they're very radical. So I also really love that they correspond quite a lot with Bioeconomy's very present day modern kind of way of exploring the importance of different ways of knowing in our world, because there is a very potent place for starting to meet that which is current in our own being, that which is current in the world, without reinforcing very harmful patterns of conflict and separation. So he says what we need is some kind of ontological mutiny, a break away from the sensorial monoculture that leaves us intact as citizen subjects. So he's saying go beyond our individuality. And he says, very interestingly, because as I feel in the Buddhist teachings that the experience of loss is one of those places where we undo, where we potentially can come into a different way of knowing. And he says, my sense of things is that we can begin with loss. Loss is the most prolific and most fervent creation of the universe. You can say the constant thing in the universe of change is that it produces movement, loss, bodies spill into these frames, composted paradigms. Our cells fall to the ground. We are murmurations of becoming. So, and within this, like, we can have these invitations, say that, like, the Buddha sends us to, within these murmurations of becoming, what do we want to be cultivating? How do we want to play our part in this deeper life that we're part of with this awake heart? And this for me is a level of practice that takes us it can really challenge some of our assumptions, some of our comfort zones. It can also help us to hold that which is very difficult. So Ajahn Sumedha would say, you know, this profound awareness we have can help us to hold the deepest fear, the biggest anger. It can be responsive, it can be sensitive, you know. And then, you know, he was within a patriarchal system which he doesn't challenge, you know. So this is like, it's like, well, it hands the basket on. It's like, well, come on, how do we relate, you know? It's like with our awareness to, you know, to the situations in which we're finding ourselves, and find that awakeness within our own hearts, our own beings. And I'll stop soon because we're coming towards the end, but Bayo Akamalafi, and I really love this sense as he talks about, as we relate in this way, we're becoming sanctuary. We're becoming sanctuary in our own being, and we can be creating sanctuary if we're relating in this way in the communities that we're part of. We can be part of creating sanctuary, of helping to midwife this different way of being in the world. So yeah, this is a big area to go into, but I hope that I've conveyed something, how like these very simple, there is something about really deepening into the very simple tools that are offered in the Buddhist teachings, and also elsewhere. There's so much within indigenous ways of knowing that hold such keys in this way as well. But there's in the Buddhist teachings themselves, there's something a very deep invitation into being Dharma, allowing that to call us and to shape our sense of practice, allow us to open into different ways of knowing, of being, of doing, if we can allow ourselves to keep leaning into them. And how we relate in the world then also shifts and transforms, because our sense of listening and ethics is much more responsive and connected. So I'll stop there. I hope there was something helpful. If not, then please just let it pass on. And for anyone who'd like to stay on, there'll be like 15-20 minutes of questions. But before you go, let me just put in the chat that if you would like to offer dana to support Sacred Mountain Sangha, that's most gratefully received. So I know you often you pay a small inscription fee for these sessions, so it's just if you wish to, but the possibility of offering dana. And also in terms of upcoming events, there's the link there for that. And next week there'll be a fundraiser for Sacred Mountain Sangha, which is on the Sunday, replacing this Sunday session, and it's with Kittisaro Tanisara and Deborah Eden Tal, and it's about luminous darkness, so somewhat related to this theme, and it'll be brilliant, so please come. Okay, I'll just pop that in the chat. Great. And so anyone who wants to stay on, please stay, and if you need to leave, then please feel welcome. So I'll just stop the recording for this part.